A lonely rancher, a dusty frontier, and a deal that seems too good to be true. Silas Ward, a man hardened by 15 years of grief, thought it was just another day. That is, until he saw them. 3 magnificent horses standing silently by the road, their heads strangely covered by burlap sacks. The desperate seller claimed it was to keep them calm, but Silas's gut told him something was deeply wrong. What he didn't know was that paying $200 for these mysterious animals would unravel a dark, 15-year-old secret of murder and betrayal, forcing him to confront a truth that would change his life forever. The sun was a searing promise on the eastern horizon, bleeding pale orange and violet into the vast, indifferent blue of the Montana sky. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything on Silas Ward's ranch. The weathered gray planks of the barn, the splintered rails of the corral, the cracked leather of his own calloused hands. At 43, Silas had spent his entire life on this frontier, and the land had etched its story onto his face, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth. It was a story of drought, blizzard, loneliness, and loss. His morning routine was a ritual, a silent communion with the land that had taken as much as it had given. The rhythmic creak of the well pump, the splash of cold water on his face, the bitter taste of black coffee brewed over a low fire. These were the constants in a life that had been violently upended 15 years ago and had never truly righted itself since. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who conserves his energy because he knows the day will demand all of it, and then some. But this morning, the familiar solitude was broken. 3 silhouettes stood unnervingly still beside the main track leading to his property, stark against the burgeoning dawn. Horses. That wasn't unusual. Drifters and traders often passed through. What was unusual, what sent a prickle of unease up Silas's spine, was that each of the 3 animals had a coarse burlap sack tied crudely over its head. They stood blind and silent, like equine prisoners awaiting a verdict. Beside them, a man slumped against a dead cottonwood, his posture a study in defeat. As Silas approached, the man straightened up, and the scent of cheap whiskey and desperation reached him on the morning breeze. The man was worn down to the nub, his clothes frayed, his face a roadmap of poor choices and bad luck. "Mornin'," the man rasped, his voice gravelly. "Name's Boone Carter. See you're admiring the stock." Silas's gaze didn't leave the horses. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were accustomed to assessing livestock in a single, sweeping glance. There was a powerful-looking black stallion, a sturdy bay mare, and a paint horse whose patches of white were so bright they seemed to glow in the early light. Despite their obscured heads, their conformation spoke of quality. They were well-built, strong-limbed, a far cry from the usual broken-down nags peddled by men like Carter. "Why the sacks?" Silas asked, his tone flat and direct. It was a voice that rarely wasted a word. Carter spat a stream of tobacco juice near his own worn boots. "Had a run-in with some Cheyenne a few days back. A raid. Spooked 'em something terrible. The sacks, they keep 'em calm. Can't see what ain't there, you know." Silas knew horses. He knew fear, and he knew calming techniques. A blindfold might be used for a moment, to lead a panicked animal from a fire, but to keep them sacked for days. It was cruel. It was wrong. Something was deeply amiss. He ran a hand along the top rail of his fence, his thumb tracing the grain of the wood. His ranch, once a bustling operation he'd shared with his younger brother, Marcus, was now a quiet monument to his solitude. He had his cattle, a few reliable cow ponies. But these 3 horses, they stirred something in him. He walked closer, his boots scuffing in the dust. The black stallion shifted its weight, muscles rippling under its dark coat. The bay mare stood stoically, as if resigned to her fate. But it was the paint that held his attention. Something about its stance, the way it held its neck, plucked a chord deep in his memory. A faint, ghostly note he couldn't quite identify. It was less a thought and more a feeling, a warmth that flickered in the cold, empty chambers of his heart. "I don't buy blind," Silas stated, his eyes narrowing on Carter. "Take off the sacks." Carter's desperation flared into a brief, defensive anger. "No, I told you they're spooked. You take off them sacks, they'll bolt for the territories. You want 'em, you buy 'em as they are. It's a risk, I grant you, but I'm making you a deal." Silas continued his slow, circling appraisal of the paint. He noticed the way the burlap was tied, tight under the jaw. Just below the knot, where the sack was pulled taut against the horse's cheek, he saw it. Or rather, he thought he saw it. A dark marking on the white hide, peeking out from under the rough fabric. It was shaped like a crescent moon. A jolt went through him, sharp and electric. It was like lightning striking a dead tree, momentarily illuminating a forgotten landscape. A crescent moon, a boy's laughter echoing across a pasture, a proud young man showing off his first horse, a flashy paint with a unique marking right on its cheek. "Look, Silas, it's like the moon fell right out of the sky and landed on him. I'm going to call him Zeke." Marcus's voice, clear as a bell across 15 years of silence. Silas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. It couldn't be. Zeke, his brother's beloved horse, had died in the fire. They all had. The fire that had taken Marcus, that had burned their shared barn to the ground and reduced their dreams to ash. The official report, delivered by Sheriff Tom Rollins himself, had been clear. A tragic accident. A lantern knocked over in the hayloft. Marcus had been trapped. The animals, locked in their stalls, had perished with him. Yet here was a paint horse, for sale by a desperate drunk, with what looked like the very same marking. And the feeling it stirred in him. It wasn't just a vague memory. It was grief. It was love. It was the ghost of his brother standing right beside him. "What's your price?" Silas asked, his voice now dangerously quiet. He forced himself to look away from the paint, to school his features back into a mask of disinterest. He couldn't let this weasel, Carter, see the turmoil raging inside him. Boone Carter seemed to sense a shift in the current. He'd been expecting a dismissal, another hard-faced rancher telling him to move along. The question, asked with such sudden intensity, gave him a sliver of hope. He tried to puff out his chest, to adopt the air of a shrewd businessman rather than a man selling off his last hope for a bottle. "These are fine animals," Carter began, his voice taking on a wheedling salesman's pitch. "That stallion, Thunder, he's got champion blood in him. The mare, Belle, she's a breeder's dream. And the paint, well, he's a solid workhorse, strong as an ox." The names, Thunder, Belle, another blow, landing squarely in Silas's gut. He gripped the fence rail, his knuckles turning white. Thunder and Belle were the names of Marcus's other two prized horses, a matched pair he'd bought with money from their first successful cattle drive. A black stallion with a temper as fierce as a summer storm, and a gentle bay mare who would follow Marcus around like a puppy. It was impossible. A coincidence of names and markings, too cruel to be believed. The fire had been 15 years ago. These horses would be old now, but not ancient. The stallion still looked powerful, the mare strong. It was plausible, but his mind rebelled against it. To believe this was to believe that the story of the last 15 years of his life The story he had built his entire lonely existence upon was a lie. "I'm not a rich man," Silas said, testing the waters. "And I'm looking at 3 blindfolded horses being sold by a man who smells like a distillery. That's a lot of risk." Carter's shoulders slumped again. The brief flicker of salesmanship died out, replaced by raw, pleading desperation. "Look, mister, I need to get to California. I need a stake. I'm not gonna lie, I'm in a bad way. These horses, they're the last thing I got." "Where'd you say you got them?" Silas pressed, his gaze like a physical weight on Carter. "I told you. Won 'em off a fella who'd had that run-in with the Cheyenne. He was in a bigger hurry than me." Carter mumbled, avoiding Silas's eyes. The lie was thin, transparent. Silas could see the fear behind it. Carter wasn't just desperate. He was running from something. Silas knew he should walk away. Every instinct, honed by decades of survival on the frontier, screamed that this was trouble. This was a hornet's nest, and he was about to poke it with a stick. Buying stolen horses, and he was becoming more certain with every passing second that they were stolen, was a fool's errand. It could bring the law down on him, or worse, the men they were stolen from. But then his eyes drifted back to the paint. To Zeke, if it was him. If these horses were his brothers, then they hadn't died in the fire. And if they hadn't died in the fire, then what else in Sheriff Rollins' report was a lie? The question opened a chasm in his soul, a dark, terrifying abyss of possibilities. For 15 years, he had accepted the story. He had mourned, he had hardened his heart, and he had endured. He had built a fortress of solitude around the memory of a tragic accident. What if the foundation of that fortress was sand? The pull was no longer a vague, emotional stirring. It was a physical force, a deep, resonant command from a part of himself he thought had died with Marcus. It was the voice of loyalty, of brotherhood, of a love that fire and time had not been able to extinguish. He had to know. He had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The risk of buying trouble was nothing compared to the risk of letting this one chance, this one impossible link to his past, ride away with a drunken fool. $200, Carter blurted out, his voice cracking. "For all 3, that's my final offer. It's a steal, and you know it. $200 and I'm out of your hair for good." $200 was a significant sum, more than Silas could comfortably part with. It was money for winter feed, for repairs to the barn, for the 100 other things a ranch demanded. But as he looked at the 3 shrouded figures, he wasn't seeing an expense. He was seeing a reckoning. He thought of Marcus's face, bright with youth and optimism. He remembered the pride in his brother's eyes as he'd brushed down Zeke's coat until it shone. He remembered the shared dream they'd had for this land, a dream of a sprawling, prosperous ranch, of families and futures. A dream that had turned to smoke and ash. "All right," Silas said, the word feeling momentous, heavy as a tombstone. "I'll take them." Relief washed over Boone Carter's face so completely that he seemed to shrink, all the tension draining out of him. "You won't regret it, mister. They're good horses." Silas went into the small, Spartan cabin that had been his home for 2 decades. He pulled a heavy cash box from beneath a loose floorboard, the same spot where he and Marcus used to hide their savings. He counted out the worn bills, the paper thin and soft from years of circulation. This felt less like a transaction and more like a ransom. He handed the money to Carter, who snatched it with a trembling hand and stuffed it into his pocket without even counting. The man's only goal was to be gone. He untied the horse's lead ropes from the cottonwood and handed them to Silas. "They're all yours," Carter said, already backing away. He didn't offer a handshake or a bill of sale. He just turned and began walking, almost running, down the track, not once looking back. Silas stood alone in the rising sun, holding the ropes of 3 ghosts. The air was still, the world silent, save for the frantic pounding of his own heart. The weight of the ropes in his hand was immense. He felt a profound sense of unease, a deep foreboding that he had just invited a storm into his quiet life. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Something that had been absent for 15 years. A flicker of purpose. He had to know the truth. He had to look under those sacks. As Boone Carter's figure disappeared over the rise, a profound silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the soft snort of the bay mare. The sun was higher now, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. Silas stood frozen for a long moment, the lid ropes clutched in his fist. The heat of the day was building, but a chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. He was standing on the precipice of a revelation, and he was terrified of what he would find. He led the 3 horses into the main corral, their hooves kicking up soft puffs of dust. Their blind submission was unnerving. He tied the ropes of the stallion and the mare to a sturdy post, then turned his full attention to the paint. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the knot of the burlap sack. The rough fabric was coarse against his fingertips. The horse stood perfectly still, as if it too were holding its breath. He could feel the animal's warmth, smell the familiar scent of horsehide and hay. He worked the knot loose, his heart hammering against his ribs. The rope fell away, and he slowly, carefully, began to lift the sack. First, a white muzzle, flecked with gray hairs of age, came into view. Then, a soft brown eye, fringed with long, pale lashes. The eye blinked slowly in the sudden light, then focused on him. And in that gaze, Silas saw a flicker of recognition, a deep, ancient knowing that transcended the years of separation. He pulled the sack completely off. The world seemed to stop. The air stilled. The sun froze in the sky. There, on the horse's cheek, stark against the brilliant white hide, was a perfect crescent moon. Zeke, Silas breathed, the name a ragged whisper torn from his soul. The horse whickered softly and nudged his shoulder, the same way it used to do when it was a colt, begging for a piece of apple. It was him, older, scarred by time and hardship. But it was undeniably, miraculously, Zeke, his brother's horse, the horse that was supposed to be bones and ash beneath the soil of the old barn. Silas dropped to his knees in the dust of the corral. The strength went out of his legs, and a sound escaped his throat, a raw, guttural sob that he had held back for 15 years. The fortress he had built around his heart crumbled into dust, and a tidal wave of grief and memory washed over him, drowning him in its force. He saw it all again, as vividly as if it were happening right now. The smell of smoke, thick and acrid, waking him in the dead of night. The horrifying orange glow against his cabin window. The desperate, frantic rush to the barn, a towering inferno against the black sky. He remembered the terrible heat, the roar of the flames, the sickening sound of collapsing timbers. He remembered screaming Marcus's name until his throat was raw, trying to get close, but being driven back by a wall of fire. He remembered Sheriff Rollins arriving with a few men, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. Rollins, a man they'd known for years, had put a hand on his shoulder. "It's too late, Silas. No one could have survived that. It's a tinderbox." The next morning, sifting through the smoldering ruins, they'd found what was left. The official story was pieced together. Marcus, working late, must have knocked over a lantern. The hay went up in a flash. He was trapped. The horses, locked in their stalls for the night, shared his fate. It was a tragic, senseless accident, the kind that was all too common on the frontier. Silas had believed it. In the fog of his grief, why wouldn't he? He had buried a coffin filled with little more than charred remnants, erected a simple wooden cross on a hill overlooking the ranch, and sealed his heart against the pain. He had accepted the unacceptable because he had to, in order to survive. But Zeke's warm breath on his neck was a testament to a different truth. The horse was alive. The story was a lie. He wrapped his arms around the paint's neck, burying his face in its coarse mane, and wept. He wept for his brother, for the years of stolen life. He wept for his own blind ignorance, for the guilt that now clawed at him. How could he not have known? How could he have simply accepted the story and let the truth lie buried for so long? The horse stood patiently, a solid, living anchor in the swirling chaos of Silas's emotions. After a long time, the storm of tears subsided, leaving him hollowed out, exhausted, but with a cold, hard clarity settling in his mind. The fire wasn't an accident. If Zeke was alive, he hadn't been in the barn. Someone had taken him before the fire started. Someone had stolen his brother's horses and then set the blaze to cover their tracks. And if they went to that much trouble, the horrifying conclusion struck him with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just set a fire to cover up a theft. They had set a fire to cover up a murder. Marcus hadn't been trapped by accident. He had been killed. The grief that had just washed through him began to cool, to harden, crystallizing into something else. It became a cold, dense core of rage. A pure, righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of his sorrow and left only a singular, chilling purpose. He had mourned his brother for 15 years. Now he would avenge him. With trembling hands and a newfound, terrible resolve, Silas pushed himself to his feet. The dust clung to the knees of his trousers. He looked at Zeke, truly looked at him, and saw not just a ghost from the past, but the first piece of a puzzle he was now compelled to solve. The horse's gentle eyes seemed to watch him, waiting. He turned to the other two animals, who had stood silently through his emotional collapse. His heart was a leaden weight in his chest. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, what he would find. Still, he had to see. He had to be sure. He walked over to the bay mare. She was a handsome animal, with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor, even in her blindfolded state. He untied the rope and gently lifted the sack from her head. She blinked, her long lashes fluttering, and looked at him with a soft, questioning gaze. She was older now, her muzzle grayed, a few faint scars marking her sleek coat. But there was no mistaking her. It was Belle. Marcus had named her for her gentle nature, and even after 15 years of unknown hardship, that gentleness was still there in her eyes. He remembered Marcus leading her into the corral for the first time, her head held high, a look of pure pride on his brother's face. A fresh wave of pain and anger washed over Silas. This gentle creature, who wouldn't harm a fly, had been stolen away, her master murdered, her life turned into a long, wandering nightmare. Finally, he faced the black stallion. This was the one he dreaded the most. Thunder had been Marcus's pride and joy, a magnificent, spirited animal with a coat like polished jet and a fire in his eyes that matched his name. He was powerful, willful, and utterly devoted to Marcus, who was the only one who could handle him with ease. Silas's hands were steady now, the trembling replaced by an icy calm. He undid the final knot. As he lifted the sack, the stallion tossed his head with a flash of his old spirit, his nostrils flaring. A jagged white scar ran down his powerful neck, a testament to a hard life. But the fire was still there in his dark, intelligent eyes. It was Thunder. The three of them were here. Zeke, Belle, and Thunder. Marcus's horses, standing in his corral, alive and breathing, 15 years after they were supposed to have been burned to cinders. The truth was laid bare before him, stark and brutal. The fire was arson. The horses were stolen. Marcus was murdered. Every part of the official story was a lie. A carefully constructed deception designed to hide the most heinous of crimes. And who had delivered that story? Who had managed the investigation, declared it an accident, and closed the case with such neat finality? Sheriff Tom Rollins. The name echoed in the silence of the corral. No longer the name of a familiar, respected lawman, but the name of a monster. Rollins had been a friend, or so they'd thought. He'd shared coffee at their table, offered condolences with a somber face, and assured Silas that justice, in its own sad way, had been served. It had all been a performance, a cruel, elaborate charade. Silas's mind raced, re-examining the past 15 years through this new, horrifying lens. He remembered other fires on other ranches over the years. Good men who'd lost everything. The stories were always the same: a tragic accident, a lantern kicked over, a stray spark. And always, it was the ranches with the best livestock, the most valuable bloodlines. How many of those had been accidents? How many other families had been fed the same lie while Rollins and his cronies made off with their prize animals? It was a ring. A sophisticated, ruthless horse-thieving operation, led by the very man sworn to uphold the law. They didn't just steal horses. They erased the evidence, and the owners, with fire. The guilt that had pricked at him before now returned with suffocating force. He had been so consumed by his own grief that he had never questioned the official report. He had let his brother's murderers walk free, grow prosperous and respected on a foundation of lies and blood. He had honored Marcus's memory by retreating from the world when he should have been out in it, hunting for the truth. He looked from one horse to the next. They were more than just living proof of a crime. They were survivors. They had endured 15 years of who knew what hell, passed from hand to hand, until a desperate, drunken fool had brought them back home. They were the key. A cold, hard purpose settled deep in his bones. The lonely rancher, the man who had let his heart turn to stone, was gone. In his place was an executioner. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he made a silent vow to the memory of his brother and to the 3 living ghosts in his corral. He would uncover the entire conspiracy. He would expose Tom Rollins for the murderer he was, and he would make him pay. Justice had been delayed for 15 years. It would not be delayed a moment longer. He led the horses from the corral to the pasture behind the barn, a lush patch of green he'd kept irrigated even in the driest years. He opened the gate. Zeke, Bell, and Thunder walked through, their steps hesitant at first, then more confident as their hooves met the soft grass. They lowered their heads and began to graze. The simple, peaceful act, a stark contrast to the storm raging in Silas's soul. They were home, and their return had just declared a war. Silas spent the rest of the day in a fugue state, his mind a whirlwind of rage, grief, and tactical planning. He cleaned his rifle, oiled the action until it was smooth as silk, and checked his supply of ammunition. Every routine task was now imbued with a deadly new significance. The world had shrunk to a single point, exposing Rollins. But how? It was his word, the word of a reclusive rancher against that of a popular, long-serving sheriff. He had the horses, but that was circumstantial. He needed more. He needed proof. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of crimson and gold, he saw a lone rider approaching. It wasn't the hurried, furtive gait of a man like Boone Carter, nor the arrogant swagger of a lawman. This rider moved with a steady, determined pace, as if they had been traveling for a very long time and knew exactly where they were going. Silas picked up his rifle, his instincts on high alert. He stood in the shadow of his porch, watching as the rider drew closer. It was a woman. She was dressed in practical, dusty riding clothes, her face partially obscured by the brim of her hat. As she entered the yard and dismounted, she pushed the hat back, and Silas's breath caught in his throat. Time had changed her, adding lines of hardship and resolve to her face. But he knew her instantly. It was Mercy Whitmore. 15 years ago, Mercy had been Marcus's fiancée. She was the vibrant, laughing heart of their small world, her spirit as bright as her auburn hair. They were to be married that spring. After the fire, in the haze of her own devastating grief, she had simply disappeared. Her family said she'd gone back east to live with relatives, unable to bear the memories. Silas had never seen or heard from her again, and now here she was, standing in his yard, looking not like the heartbroken girl he remembered, but like a seasoned tracker. Her eyes, the color of mossy stones, swept the property and landed on the 3 horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. A choked gasp escaped her lips. She took a tentative step forward, then another, her gaze locked on the animals. "Zeke," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and a fragile, burgeoning hope. "Belle? Thunder?" She broke into a run, stumbling through the dust, her hands outstretched. The horses lifted their heads. Zeke whinnied, a clear, ringing sound of recognition, and trotted toward the fence to meet her. Belle and Thunder followed close behind. Mercy reached the fence and pressed her face against Zeke's, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Silas lowered his rifle, his own carefully constructed composure threatening to crack once more. He walked out to meet her, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. "Mercy," he said, his voice hoarse. She turned, her eyes shining with tears. "Silas, it's them. It's really them. I knew it. I knew I'd find them one day." "How did you get here?" he asked, his mind struggling to process this second impossible return. "I've been tracking them for 15 years, she said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by the vindication of this moment. "Not these specific horses, not at first. I was tracking a rumor. A story about a horse-thieving ring run by a lawman who burned ranches to cover his tracks." Silas stared at her, stunned. While he had been hiding from the world, she had been hunting in it. "After the fire," she continued, her gaze turning hard as flint, "I couldn't accept it. Marcus was too careful. He loved those animals too much to be careless with a lantern. It never felt right. I started asking questions, quietly at first. People told me to let it go, that I was crazy with grief. But I kept digging." She had spent years following a cold trail, piecing together whispers and rumors from disgraced stable hands, nervous blacksmiths and ranchers who had lost everything. The trail was faint, obscured by fear and time. But one name kept surfacing, a name spoken only in hushed, fearful tones. Sheriff Tom Rollins. "Boone Carter, the man you bought them from," Mercy said, anticipating his next question. "He's a small-time player, a drunk who fell in with Rollins' crew years ago. He gets paid to move the horses far away from where they were stolen, to sell them off where no one would know their history. But he got sloppy. He got scared. I've been on his trail for 2 weeks, ever since I heard he had a paint, a bay, and a black that matched their descriptions. She had been the one hunting Carter, and in his fear, he had run right to the one place on earth where the horses would be recognized. He had run home. Rollins is the one, Silas," she said, her voice low and intense. He leads the whole operation. He murdered Marcus. He did it to get his hands on Thunder's bloodline. Marcus had refused to sell, and Rollins doesn't take no for an answer. It was all there. The confirmation of his deepest, darkest fears. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had an ally, one forged in the same fire that had consumed their past. But it's still our word against his, Silas said, the practical obstacle rearing its head. He's the law. A grim smile touched Mercy's lips. Not for long. For the last year, I've been tracking more than just horses. I've been tracking a man. Rollins' former partner, a man named Jake Morrison. Rollins cheated him out of his share one too many times, and they had a falling out. Jake was terrified of Rollins, but he was also meticulous. He kept a journal. Silas felt a surge of adrenaline. A journal. It details everything, Mercy said, her eyes burning with triumph. Every ranch they burned, every horse they stole, every man they killed. Dates, names, profits. It's all in there. Jake died of consumption 2 months ago. But before he did, he told me where he hid it. I dug it up from under his cabin floor yesterday. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a worn, oilcloth-wrapped package. She unwrapped it to reveal a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was the proof they needed. The weapon that would finally bring Rollins down. He'll know Carter came this way, Silas realized, the danger of their situation becoming starkly clear. When Carter doesn't check in, Rollins will come looking. I know, Mercy said, her hand resting on the butt of the pistol holstered at her hip. I'm counting on it. We have the horses, and we have the proof. When he comes, we'll be ready. We're going to end this, Silas. For Marcus. Looking at the woman before him, no longer a ghost from his past, but a warrior in the present, Silas felt the last of his solitude fall away. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and about to face a man who held all the power in the county. But for the first time in 15 years, he was not alone. And for the first time in 15 years, he felt a flicker of hope. The waiting was the hardest part. As dusk settled, deepening the shadows and painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and indigo, Silas and Mercy made their preparations. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. A grim understanding flowed between them. A shared purpose that was as solid and real as the rifle Silas held in his hands. He positioned himself in the hayloft of the new barn, the one he'd built with his own 2 hands over the bones of the old one. The elevated position gave him a clear line of sight over the entire yard. Mercy took up a position behind the stacked woodpile near the cabin, Jake Morrison's journal tucked safely inside her shirt. The horses, sensing the tension in the air, were restless in the pasture, their heads up, ears twitching at every night sound. It was nearly full dark when they came. 4 riders, moving not with the caution of lawmen on official business, but with the arrogant confidence of predators. At their head was Sheriff Tom Rollins, a big man who sat tall in the saddle, his silver star glinting in the moonlight. Even from a distance, Silas could feel the man's aura of corrupt authority. They rode directly into the center of the yard and dismounted. Rollins' eyes immediately went to the pasture, and a flicker of something, annoyance, recognition, crossed his face as he saw the 3 horses. "Silas Ward," Rollins boomed, his voice falsely jovial. "Heard you came into some new stock. A man named Carter was supposed to deliver them to a buyer over in Sweetwater County, but it seems he got lost. I'm here to rectify his mistake. Those horses are evidence in a theft investigation. It was a lie, bold and effortless. He was using the shield of his office to reclaim his stolen property." From the shadows of the woodpile, Mercy stepped out into the moonlight. "They're not evidence, Tom," she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the night air. "They're proof." Rollins froze. He stared at Mercy, his face a mask of disbelief, then slowly breaking into a contemptuous sneer. Mercy Whitmore. Well, I'll be. I heard you'd lost your mind after Marcus died. Looks like the rumors were true. What's this nonsense you're spouting? It's over, Rollins, Mercy said, her hand moving to rest on her pistol. I know what you did. I know you murdered Marcus. I know you burned that barn to the ground to cover it up. Rollins' 3 deputies shifted nervously, their hands drifting toward their own guns. The sheriff, however, just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You are crazy. You have no proof of anything, don't I? Mercy retorted, her voice sharp as a razor. I have a witness, a man named Boone Carter, who's probably halfway to Mexico by now, ready to tell anyone who'll listen who he was working for. And I have something better. I have Jake Morrison's journal. At the mention of the journal, all the color drained from Rollins' face. The sneer vanished, replaced by a look of pure, murderous rage. He had underestimated them. He had walked into a trap. You're lying, he hissed. But there was no conviction in his voice. Am I? Mercy said. Ask your boys if they want to hang alongside you for what's written in it. It names every single one of you. That was all it took. The pretense of the law evaporated, leaving only the raw violence that lay beneath. Rollins' hand blurred as he drew his gun. Kill them, he roared. Burn the place to the ground. The night exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. A shot from one of the deputies splintered the woodpile inches from Mercy's head as she dove for cover. From the hayloft, Silas's rifle cracked, the sound sharp and definitive. The deputy who had shot at Mercy cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder. The yard became a chaotic battleground. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in brief, terrifying strobes. Silas worked the bolt of his rifle, firing with a cold, methodical precision. He wasn't a killer by nature, but these men had murdered his brother. He felt no remorse, only a grim sense of duty. He winged another deputy, sending the man scrambling for cover behind a water trough, but they were still outnumbered. Rollins and the remaining deputy laid down a withering hail of fire, pinning both Silas and Mercy. Bullets thudded into the barn walls and ricocheted off the woodpile. It was a stalemate they couldn't win. And then something extraordinary happened. In the pasture, the horses were in a state of panic, galloping back and forth along the fence line. But it wasn't just fear. It was agitation, a shared rage. Zeke, the clever paint who had started it all, reared up and slammed his powerful chest against the gate to the corral. The wood groaned. He did it again and again, the sound of splintering wood echoing under the gunfire. With a final mighty heave, the gate burst open. Zeke charged out, not away from the fight, but directly into it. He let out a piercing, furious scream and galloped straight toward the deputy hiding behind the water trough. The man looked up, his eyes wide with terror, as the vengeful paint horse bore down on him. He fired a wild shot before turning to run, but Zeke was too fast. The horse didn't trample him, but slammed into him with his shoulder, sending the man flying. Close behind, Zeke came Thunder. The black stallion, his eyes wild with fire, charged straight for Rollins. The sheriff, distracted by the sudden chaos, turned just in time to see the massive horse descending on him like a black avalanche. He raised his pistol, but Thunder swerved at the last second, lashing out with his rear hooves. The powerful kick caught Rollins in the side, lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of agony. His pistol skittered away into the dust. Belle, the gentle mare, galloped to stand protectively near Mercy's position, snorting and stamping her feet at the remaining wounded deputies, her presence a clear warning. The tide had turned in an instant. The chaos created by the horses gave Silas and Mercy the opening they needed. Silas scrambled down from the loft as Mercy rushed forward, her pistol trained on the groaning, wounded sheriff. The two deputies, one with a wounded shoulder and the other dazed from his encounter with Zeke, saw the fight was lost and threw down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Silas kicked Rollins' pistol further away and stood over the man who had destroyed his life. Rollins clutched his side, his face pale with pain and disbelief. He had been defeated not just by the brother and fiancé of the man he'd murdered, but by the very horses he had stolen. It was a form of justice so pure, so poetic, it was almost biblical. The gun smoke slowly cleared, revealing a scene of quiet victory under the serene gaze of the moon. The showdown was over. The arrival of the U.S. Marshals, summoned by a neighbor who'd heard the gunfire, was a surreal affair. They found Sheriff Tom Rollins and his deputies bound and under guard. The yard littered with evidence of a fierce gun battle. When Mercy presented Jake Morrison's journal and Silas gave his testimony, the pieces clicked into place with undeniable certainty. Faced with the detailed, damning entries in the journal, dates of fires, lists of stolen livestock, records of payouts that corroborated with his own financial records, and the prospect of a hangman's noose, Rollins confessed. He laid out the entire operation, naming every man involved, confirming every detail of his 15-year reign of terror. His confession was not born of remorse, but of a coward's desire to avoid execution. He admitted to killing Marcus in cold blood when his brother refused to sell Thunder, then setting the fire to make it look like an accident. The truth, in all its ugly detail, was finally out. Justice, when it came, was swift. Rollins and his key associates were sentenced to life in prison at the federal penitentiary, a fate many considered worse than hanging. The corrupt empire he had built crumbled, and a sense of clean, fresh air seemed to sweep through the county. A week later, after the dust had settled, Silas and Mercy walked together up the small hill that overlooked the ranch. They stopped before the simple wooden cross that marked Marcus's grave, or rather, the place where his memory had been laid to rest. For 15 years, it had been a place of silent, solitary grief for Silas. Now, it felt different. The air was warm, and a gentle breeze rustled the tall grass. Down below, in the pasture, Zeke, Belle, and Thunder grazed peacefully, their coats shining in the afternoon sun. They were home, and their presence had changed everything. Silas knelt and ran his hand over the weathered wood of the cross. "I'm sorry, Marcus," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I let you down." Mercy placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't let him down, Silas. You were grieving. Rollins fooled everyone. What matters is that you know the truth now. He knows it too." She looked up at the vast blue sky, as if she could feel Marcus's presence there. "He can finally rest in peace. We all can." They stood there for a long time, sharing stories of Marcus, his infectious laugh, his boundless optimism, his deep love for the land and his animals. They spoke of the future he would never have, but they did so without the bitterness that had poisoned them for so long. The truth had been a cauterizing fire, burning away the infection of lies and leaving behind a clean, though tender wound that could finally begin to heal. As they walked back down the hill, an unspoken question hung in the air between them. Mercy's quest was over. She had found the truth, she had found the horses, she had brought her fiancé's murderer to justice. She was free to go anywhere, to start a new life. "You know," Silas said, breaking the silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This ranch, it's too much for one person. Always has been. Mercy looked at him, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. Is that so? Marcus and I, we had plans, Silas continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. A real legacy. It feels wrong to let that die. He stopped and turned to her, his eyes meeting hers directly. This is your home too, Mercy, if you want it to be. The horses, they'd like it if you stayed. Tears welled in Mercy's eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of homecoming. After 15 years of wandering, of living a life defined by a single burning purpose, the thought of staying, of putting down roots in the one place that had ever felt like home, was an incredible gift. I'd like that, she said softly. I think Marcus would too. They had both been hollowed out by loss, two solitary figures adrift in the harshness of the frontier. But now, in their shared grief and shared victory, they had found a new, quiet connection. It wasn't the fiery romance she had shared with Marcus, nor the easy brotherhood Silas had lost. It was something new, something forged in hardship and truth, something gentle and resilient. It was a beginning. The seasons turned. The raw, open wound of the past began to scar over, healing into something that could be lived with. Life on the Ward Ranch found a new rhythm, a quiet harmony that Silas had not known for 15 years. It was a rhythm of shared work and shared silence, of morning coffee brewed for two, of evening conversations on the porch as the sun bled out across the plains. Mercy brought a life back to the ranch that went beyond mere presence. She planted a garden, filling the dusty yard with the vibrant colors of zinnias and the fresh scent of herbs. Her laughter, at first a rare and fragile sound, became more frequent, a welcome melody against the steady bass note of the wind. She worked alongside Silas, her strength and competence a match for his own. They didn't talk much about the future, but they were building one all the same, one day at a time. The horses were the heart of this new life. They were no longer ghosts of a tragic past, but living symbols of resilience and truth. Watching them graze in the pasture, their coats sleek and healthy, was a constant reminder that what was lost could, in some form, be returned. They had brought home more than just themselves. They had carried the truth on their backs, delivered a long overdue justice, and opened the door to a healing that neither Silas nor Mercy had thought possible. Zeke, the clever paint, became Silas's constant companion on his rides, his steady presence a comfort and a link to the brother he had lost. Thunder, the fiery stallion, mellowed under Mercy's gentle hand, his spirit still strong, but his trust regained. And Belle, the sweet-natured mare, was expecting a foal in the spring, a promise of new life, of continuity, of a future that stretched beyond the shadows of the past. One cool evening, as the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness of the sky, Silas and Mercy stood by the corral fence, watching the horses. A sense of profound peace settled over the land, a peace that was reflected in their own hearts. He would have liked this, Mercy said quietly, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. Marcus. He would have loved seeing them so happy. Seeing you. Not so alone. Silas nodded, his gaze on the crescent moon marking on Zeke's cheek, now a familiar and beloved sight. He would have approved, he agreed. The long, lonely chapter of his life was over. The pain of his brother's death would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. The sacks had been removed, not just from the horses' heads, but from his own heart. He could finally see clearly. The horses, in their miraculous return, had not just uncovered a murder. They had resurrected a life. They had brought him truth. They had brought him justice. And in mercy, they had brought him a new family. The past was finally at peace. And the future, once a barren and desolate landscape, now held the quiet, shimmering promise of a new dawn. In the end, it wasn't just a mystery that was solved. It was a life that was reclaimed. The horses brought more than just the truth of a heinous crime. They brought justice, healing, and a second chance at life for both Silas and Mercy. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that the past, no matter how deeply buried, can find its way home. It's a reminder that sometimes the most loyal witnesses have 4 legs, and that true justice can arrive in the most unexpected ways. If this story of frontier justice and redemption moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button and sharing it with others. And for more incredible stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.